Well, I'm David Davis, and I work with the, we've got a few more chairs up here. I work with the Response to Intervention Project here in Florida. And back in 2011, we moved support for assistive technology, accessible educational materials, and universal design for learning at a state level into the Response to Intervention Project. So we look at things from a multi-system of supports, and it's a lot of changes in thinking. And one of the things that we've started doing with our language is talking about universal education. So what I'm going to do is talk a bit about ways of thinking. And then I've also got some actual tools that around the standards and around instructional design and stuff to share also. These are all online in the whatever they call the thing, where it talks about the session. So you can, all this stuff you can get very, very easily. So we went around. Let me tell you a little bit about myself. I love science fiction. And this is really doing something weird with the pictures, so I'm not sure how. Oh, it's probably this thing's covering it up. That's okay, we'll live with it. And so, in fact, I think what I'm going to do, just to make sure that this works, is see if I can. Are you still up there? Okay, or have I lost you? Okay, what did I do to do that? Hold on. Okay. We're going to end up looking at this from within PowerPoint because we just need to make an accommodation to make sure that that space down there is available for everybody. So let's do this, and we're going to work at it from this way. Okay, is that good enough? Can y'all see? So, and good, we're great here. So this is a scene from a movie from several years ago called Upside Down. And in the movie, I just like special effects, okay? Anything that's pretty, it's got me. Flashy, it's got me. Sparkly, it's got me. So there were these two planets that were very close together. They were so close together, they didn't really communicate a lot with each other, except for this one building. They had built a building between the two planets. And so it was this business building, and so there were all these floors. But right in the middle of it, because it was between the gravities, between the two planets, you could actually have a floor where you had people on the ceiling and people on the floor, or depending on your point of view, people on the floor, people on the ceiling. Because everybody was attached to their planet. Whatever was made on a planet, whoever was born on a planet, their center of gravity was that planet. And no matter what they did, they always ended up going back to that planet. So they could work like this, which made it a little difficult when they had to have meetings. So their meetings would end up being something like this, where they would talk to each other, but and you would feel like you're having the same conversation. But you're not really having the same conversation because your center of gravity is different. So it's actually from a whole different point of view from the other person. And we hit this a lot. We find that we can have conversations for hours with people and work on, and the one that I think a lot of people talk about that we hit all the time too, is you can talk about learning and designing lessons and do it for hours, and everybody go, yes, we want engagement. Yes, we want to really work with the student, help make sure the student's learning. And then you bring up something like calculators, and they say, well, we can't use calculators because they're not allowed on the end of the year test. And you had this whole conversation the whole day on engagement and on instructional design for learning. And you realize you did not have the same conversation. You thought you were having the same conversation, but the reality was you had different centers of gravity. And no matter what you did, you were doing everything from your own center of gravity, from your own point of view. And there was some discussion this morning about that there are things within just the way we were raised, within the culture that we know, that we don't think about it, but it's like a center of gravity. It keeps pulling us back, and it ends up where you have conversations, the words are the same, but the meaning is not the same. So I want to talk a little bit about two areas. There's lots of different areas, and I can promise you, that anytime you're in, for example, a room with this many people in it, we have lots of different centers of gravity because we have lots of different backgrounds, we have lots of different experiences. So we're going to talk and have conversations, and the reality is we may be having very different conversations, but that's okay. That's a part of the nature of it. That's the way we grow. But it is something that happens. And so when you're trying to do universal design for learning with folks, you can say stuff and talk about stuff, but the reality is because of wherever our center of gravity is, wherever our worldview is, we're going to interpret things differently. We're going to understand things differently. And these talks were designed to be informal. So if you want to make a comment or ask a question at any time, please feel free. But we're jumping on in. So the two centers of gravity we're going to look at, we're going to start with the bell curve, because this is one of the biggest centers of gravity that we all have. Most of us came up in schools where the curriculum, where everything was designed with the understanding of a bell curve. It's learning for some. You've got average performers. So when they talk about the myth of average, there is this concept that's just instilled in us that there are average performers, there are some high performers, and you're going to have some low performers and some people that fail. That's just expected, because it's that curve, it's that way of thinking. You teach to the middle. My wife and I went to school in the 70s, and in the educational classes then, you were told, teach to the middle. And you teach to the middle, and the bell curve just happens. Is sort of the thing. And I still hear teachers talking about teaching to the middle. That's just something that is still very much ingrained, even though we have done a lot about talking about differentiated instruction and all kinds of things. This teach to the middle concept is still within our educational repertoire. It indicates both student and educator response patterns. In the student response patterns, you've got this bell curve, and in the educator, it's the middle, that you're teaching to the middle. You're teaching for the average and letting the rest happen. It's based on a static curriculum. Again, just like teaching to the middle, the curriculum's designed to the middle. You may add some things for the high performers or some remediation for the lower performers, but even that is added to a core curriculum. And it has margins to design to. So when we talk about the myth of average, it's bouncing off the existence of this. When we talk about designing to the edges or designing to the margins, that's a bell curve way of thinking, because the bell curve is what has edges and margins. Now, what we've been moving to is, for the past several years, is trying to figure out how to change our way of thinking from a bell curve to, for us in Florida, a multi-tiered system of supports. And again, this is a response pattern, except with this, it's learning for all. There is no low performers or high performers. There are increasingly intensive tiers of instruction, but the performance, the expected performance for all students is for all students to perform at grade level or proficiency, which is a bit higher than grade level. So that there is no curve for the students. There is an expectation of learning for all. I mentioned the tiers of instructional intensity. That's what changes, which means that in Tier 1, if the only thing you're going to change is instructional intensity, then Tier 1 has to be universal. It has to be designed with the universal design for learning. It has to have everything embedded in it that meets the needs of all students, because the only thing you're going to change is the intensity of the instruction. That's a huge difference. That takes you away from the static curriculum to something that has to have a lot of flexibility and a lot of options in it, and it's just a very, very different way of thinking. And within this way of thinking, instead of designing to the edges or to the margins, we have systemic variability. Now, we still talk about designing to the edges because we talk a lot with people who's understand a bell curve. That's still where they're thinking. But the reality is we want to move, for us, to a place where there are no margins, but there is systemic variability. So there's no average, there is systemic variability. And so you design with systemic variability in mind. And you can have the same conversations, but it's different centers of gravity. It's different ways of thinking. The bell curve, originally with the curriculum in general education, there were no supports for students with disabilities. Think about the 70s when they started Child Find and they started doing services for students with disabilities. They developed different services. They didn't transform general education. They didn't transform the curriculum. They simply created another system of services. And yet it is this system that was never designed for students with disabilities that we use an IEP process to help students to have access to. There's a problem in our design with this, and particularly with the way that a lot of people use the RTI model for eligibility. I mean, right off the bat, I ask people from different places around the country, can you have a disability and still be successful in Tier 1 without an IEP? You're successful. And they will say, well, no, you can't be successful in Tier 1 if you don't have an IEP, because you can't be successful if you have a disability. That's a problem, and people don't say that, but it's in the design, and it's what we believe in. It's a part of our way of thinking that that you have to have something added. If you have a disability, you have to have some additional service, something else, because what's originally there, general education, is not designed for you to be successful in. And that's what we want to change. We want to get it to where Tier 1 is designed so that every student can be successful in engaging with the instruction, and there are no barriers. And then what we increase are intensities of instruction. There's minimal problem solving going on here because the results are expected, and it's restricted by a false sense of fairness. In other words, you can't give a student an accommodation because that makes it unfair, and it messes up your bell curve. And the bell curve is this thing that says fairness. This is right. If we do this, then we've done the right thing. What we're looking for is specially designed instruction embedded in all tiers. Everything, again, that students need, every student, is in Tier 1. Problem solving is occurring within and between the tiers, and you're focusing on successful learning pathways for all students. And one of our dreams is that at some point we can get to a place where there's a difference in looking at response to intervention as far as eligibility, so that you're looking not at whether a student failed, but that the student was successful, and you're asking, how were they successful? What's the pathway to success that they took? And what does that tell us about the student? And that's a very different system, but it's one that we're at. So in order to do any of this, we really have to look at universal design for learning as our system of design at the beginning. But when we talk to people about it, we have started talking about universal education to help folks to start to change their way of thinking. And it is a language thing, but it helps to disrupt some stuff. A lot of people take UDL and they apply it to a framework for special education, or they take UDL and they apply it to a framework for general education. And they're applying UDL to a bell curve model. And it's great because we're getting some great results, but we really want to get away from the bell curve model and get to the place to where we're looking at really providing learning for all. And so these are just some differences in thinking. Any thoughts on this before I go to the next slide?
I've seen where the bell curve is replaced by a J curve.
Okay.
Where, the expectation is not that you're going to have this normal or average and then the high and the low, but the expectation is that you might have, like all students are meeting the expectations, some higher than others, but the expectation is that all of the students meet the expectation.
Okay.
So the curve starts here in the center, I guess, kind of, but then goes up.
Awesome. Awesome. Any other thoughts? Where do you think you fit as far as when you think about, do you consider or do you see where the bell curve has just sort of in our way of thinking? Do you feel like you've been able to let go of it? Are you not wanting to even talk? Yes, you have to. We have to be able to let go and move on. So I want to share some tools. And Ann here, so Ann, your tool is going to come up right after this. I think. Actually, I'm not seeing down there, but that's okay. This, I just wanted to hit, this is language from Florida statute on inclusion, and it says that teachers and administrators support universal education and have the knowledge and support available to enable them to effectively teach all children. So in Florida, we have some statutory language that we can use to talk about universal education and help people to start to move in this direction. We also have some papers that have been put out from the Florida Department of Education that talks about universal instruction and universal design for learning and brings these pieces together. So we have a basis in Florida to start with some talk to really kind of change people's ways of thinking. Here we go. Yeah, that looks familiar. So what you've got, I'm just going to quickly check my time here, real quickly. Go over some documents that I have that you can download and look at. This one, and hopefully I will not mess up. There we go. Okay, you can still see the text. So this is an example standard, 7th grade standard. We've got the verbs in red, we've got nouns in magenta, and then we've got adjectives in green to help people to start to really parse and understand the standards. But we also have the standard, and then we have with it the access point that goes with the standard. And in Florida, the access point is the point that we use for students with the most significant cognitive disabilities. This document also has supporting standards for the standard, and then for every access point, we have what we call essential understandings. And so essential understandings for this standard, which is solve real-world and mathematical problems involving the 4 operations with rational numbers. And then we have a lot of essential understandings for the access point that typically are for students with the most significant cognitive disabilities, which is identify rational numbers that are at equal distance from 0 on a number line, find the distance between 2 rational numbers on a number line, and on and on and on. And typically what happens in Florida is that the only people that ever look at the access point information are teachers that are working with students with the most significant cognitive disabilities. But within a universal education setting, the goal is to understand the standard. What is the standard asking for? What kind of knowledge is entailed in the standard? Because the more you have of this, the more options you can start to design in your instruction, because you have more things to look at. And what we find is that a lot of people will look at the standard and then try to create some activities around it, but they've never really gone through the standard enough to get this much information, even for students that don't have a significant cognitive disability. Just your 2 minutes. Yes, hurry, hurry, hurry. So, and this document that you look at will also have a lot of other information. For example, instructional implications of the standard. Student must be provided with the opportunity to utilize a variety of tools to solve problems involving the 4 operations. There's just a lot of information in this document. It's several pages long, and it is a great example of when you're starting to do universal design for learning and you want to address the standards, having your district provide documents like this to your teachers. And we have districts in Florida that are working on this. They have been for several years working on curriculum documents, giving them to the teachers with the standards broken down, analyzed, rubrics, everything, so that the teachers can then take that and build their instruction from it. It gives you a basis for really starting to look at universal design for learning. So that's one of the documents here. Another document we have is a curriculum planning self-assessment tool that a district can use to look at whether or not they're providing all of these types of documents ahead of time for teachers. When teachers have to do all this on their own, they can have a difficult time doing UDL, or they can do UDL, but it may not really align with the standards they need to be addressing. So having these documents ahead of time makes it much easier for teachers to start to look at universal design for learning and options. And we've got, I'm going to jump to one other, I'm going to skip that document. This last one I want to show you real quick that we use How many people are familiar with the acronym ICEL? I-C-E-L? Just a few, okay. So we use it a bunch in Florida, and there's some other states I've seen use it, but I don't know that it's that. Anyway, it's instruction, curriculum, environment, and learner. And basically it's something we use to help people think about doing things for the changing the instruction, changing the environment, changing the curriculum first before you start looking at, is it something the learner needs to address? What do we change in the other areas first? So what we've done is within instruction, which is how the curriculum is taught, we have ideas for universal design. The curriculum, what is taught, ideas for universal design. The environment where the instruction takes place, ideas for universal design. And then the learner, who is being taught, ideas for universal design. And then in each thing, for example, instruction will have things like use of academic language and vocabulary, clear learning goals, use of intentional questions, and underneath all of these, resources and then options for flexibility. So these are some documents that you can take and start to look at from the beginning. How do you create universal education that works with every single student that you have? And we're out of time, so I'm going to hush now.